What would you do if your 14-year-old daughter walked into a bank, proud of her first scholarship, only to be treated like a criminal just because of how she looked? This is the story of Leah Carter, a brilliant young girl whose quiet strength exposed discrimination and a corporate betrayal that shook an entire institution. What started as a simple deposit became a battle for dignity, truth, and justice. Stay with us because by the end of this story, you'll see how one girl, one voice, and one choice changed everything. It was early February, a crisp and golden morning in Oak Ridge when 14-year-old Leah Carter stood at the edge of the Riverstone Trust Bank's marble steps, breathing slowly to still the quiet storm inside her chest. Dressed neatly in her St. Brie Academy school uniform, navy blazer, pressed pleated skirt, perfectly aligned, and loafers polished to a humble shine, she looked every bit the poised student she had become. But beneath that calm exterior, Leah's heart fluttered with nerves. In her hand she held a dark blue folder inside, of which lay a $5,000 scholarship check, her first ever. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of her hard work, her quiet resilience, and long nights spent poring over textbooks, while other kids watched movies. It was hers. And today she had chosen to deposit it herself, without help, without anyone holding her hand. At home that morning, her mother, Dr. Simone Carter, had looked up from her financial reports. Brow slightly furrowed, voice gentle with a hint of concern. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" Leah had only smiled, tucking the folder securely under her arm. "I'm sure, Mom. I need to do this on my own." Simone had nodded slowly, her eyes filled with something between pride and apprehension. Leah knew what that look meant. It was the look every mother wore when sending their child out into a world that wasn't always kind, especially to girls who looked like her. Now standing inside the bank's grand lobby, Leah was dwarfed by the soaring ceilings, mahogany accents, and the cool hush of whispered transactions. This was no ordinary neighborhood bank. Riverstone Trust was the kind of institution where polished shoes clicked against marble floors and clients came in wearing tailored suits. Leah had always found the place elegant, almost sacred, until now, when her confidence began to flicker under the fluorescent lights. She approached the teller line with careful steps, clutching the folder a little tighter. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint buzz of the overhead lights, the rustle of papers, the distant ring of a phone behind the glass office walls. There was no turning back. Her name was already called forward by a young teller, and with a measured breath, she stepped up. In her mind, it was supposed to be simple: hand over the check show. Her ID, maybe sign a form or two, then walk out proud. That's how independence worked, right? That's what her mother had always taught her to be, prepared, poised, and self-sufficient. But as Leah reached into her folder and offered the check, she didn't yet know that within seconds the warmth in the room would shift, the air would thicken, and a perfectly normal transaction would begin spiraling into something altogether different, quietly unsettling, quietly unjust. And yet, like the first ripple on the surface of still water, it all began with that one small moment, a teenage girl stepping into a world that hadn't quite learned to see her as she saw herself. As Leah handed the check to the young teller, his name tag reading Mark, she offered a polite smile, her voice steady, despite the tight knot forming in her stomach. "I'd like to deposit this into my savings account, please." Mark took the check with a glance, but his expression shifted almost immediately from routine courtesy to visible suspicion. He raised the check to the light, inspecting its edges like a counterfeit bill, his brows drawing close together. Leah's smile faltered. She had expected standard questions, maybe even a congratulation. What she didn't expect was the way he looked at the check, first then at her, as if there were no way they belonged in the same sentence. Behind him, the soft clicking of heels grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. Helen Grant, the bank manager, appeared in a tailored gray blazer and a cool expression that carried the weight of assumed authority. She was in her early 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and a gaze that seemed to scan for flaws. When she saw Leah, her expression didn't change, but something imperceptible passed through her eyes. Something Leah recognized but couldn't quite name. Helen stepped behind the counter, her voice cutting through the space with a practiced calm. "A $5,000 check," she asked loud enough for those in the waiting area to overhear. "For someone your age?" Leah straightened her shoulders, the words stinging more than she wanted to admit. "It's a scholarship award from St. Brie Academy," she explained carefully, reaching into her folder for the award letter and her school ID. I have all the documentation. Right here. Helen didn't even glance at the papers. We'll need to verify everything she said, with a slight sniff, turning to Mark. There's been a wave of fraudulent checks lately. We must be cautious. The word fraudulent echoed in Leah's ears, hitting harder than she expected. She felt her cheeks grow warm, her pulse quickening. She had done everything right. She had earned that scholarship through grit and sleepless nights, not shortcuts. And now in the middle of a prestigious bank lobby, she was being talked about like a con artist. She reached for her phone instinctively, only to realize, with a sick twist in her gut, that she'd left it in her school locker. I need to call my mom, she said softly, her voice cracking for the first time. She's expecting me home soon. Helen's response was ice cold, her eyes already elsewhere. That's not our concern. You'll wait here until we finish processing. With that, she turned and walked away, heels tapping in firm rejection. Leah stood frozen, surrounded by glass stone and silence, yet feeling utterly exposed. The room buzzed with quiet judgment. Whispers drifted in from the sides. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, some guarded, a few laced with pity. It should have been a 5-minute task, but now it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, and no one in the building seemed willing to offer a hand. Leah remained rooted in place, her fingers tightening around the folder, still clutched to her chest, as the seconds dragged into minutes and the minutes began to stretch into an unbearable stillness. Around her, the bank moved on. Without her, professionals in sleek suits were ushered past her, with courtesy clients were greeted with warm smiles and offered coffee. But Leah stood like a shadow, pinned to the floor, invisible yet exposed. She stole a glance toward the teller counter where Mark and Helen were whispering, their heads leaned close in a conversation that was clearly about her. Their occasional glances in her direction felt like tiny cuts, each one confirming that her presence had become an inconvenience. Her eyes scanned the lobby for something familiar, something safe, but all she saw were polished marble walls, golden light fixtures, and rows of people pretending not to notice the girl, being left to stand alone like a statue. Then she heard it, Helen's voice low but sharp, slicing through the ambient noise. "We have standards to maintain." She told Mark, her words laced with a venomous calm. "We can't let just anyone walk in and think they're entitled to service." Leah's stomach turned. It wasn't just about the check. It wasn't even about a policy. It was about her face, her age, her presence in a place where people like her were quietly, consistently told they didn't belong. The weight of those words settled on her shoulders like wet cement, heavy and suffocating. Still, she didn't move. Her mother had always taught her to stand tall in moments like this, to remain composed no matter how loud the injustice. But composure couldn't dull the sting of being watched like a threat. It couldn't soften the murmurs that danced on the edges of her hearing, snide chuckles, whispers of speculation. A soft, poor thing from somewhere behind her. Leah gritted her teeth and stared straight ahead, refusing to cry, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. But even as she stood with her back straight and her chin lifted inside, she was unraveling, wondering how something so simple had turned into a silent punishment. No one seemed willing to stop. Just as Leah thought the humiliation couldn't deepen further, Helen reappeared this time, flanked by a uniformed security staff member, an older man with a stern face and crossed arms who gave Leah a quick, impersonal glance. Helen's tone was clipped, her voice sharp enough to pierce the quiet hum of the lobby. "Please guide this young lady to the holding lounge in the back," she said, gesturing without even looking at Leah directly. "Until her documents are verified, we can't have her loitering here." The word loitering hit Leah like a slap. Suddenly she wasn't a client, she was a suspect. A presence that needed to be hidden. The security officer didn't say much, but his body language was clear. Follow without question, Leah's legs felt numb as she moved, her face burning with shame, as she passed rows of watching eyes. Some curious, some confused, none intervening. She was escorted to a small waiting area near the back corner of the bank, barely more than a padded bench and a plant that had long since withered. She sat down stiffly, her back straight, trying not to let her hands tremble. From here she could still see the lobby, see Helen greeting new customers with the smile that had never once been offered to her. Every inch of the space reminded Leah of where she didn't belong. She watched a well-dressed elderly couple walk in and receive immediate smiling attention. Just minutes ago, a young man with an accent had approached the counter with paperwork and been turned away brusquely by Helen. But the next couple, a white man and woman in business attire, were welcomed like old friends ushered to the front of the line. With warm assurance, Leah's chest tightened. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a pattern, a hierarchy, and she had been placed squarely at the bottom, her fists clenched at her sides, her eyes unblinking, her mind racing with silent outrage. The lounge she had been escorted to was called a customer holding area, but to her it felt like a soft cage, a way to hide discomfort without confronting it. She wasn't being served, she was being silenced. And as the minutes dragged on, Leah realized she wasn't just fighting for her check anymore. She was standing at the center of something much deeper, much uglier, and she was still completely alone. From her corner seat in the so-called holding lounge, Leah's eyes tracked every movement in the lobby, her gaze sharp, now no longer searching for help, but observing, recording, remembering. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was watching, and what she saw only confirmed the ache that had begun to build in her chest. Another woman, young black, modestly dressed, stepped up to the counter and was met with immediate skepticism from Mark. Papers were questioned. Voices were hushed. Seconds later, a man in an expensive suit strolled in and was greeted by Helen, personally offered a coffee and led straight to the priority service area without so much as showing ID. Leah's fingers tightened around the edges of her folder. She could no longer pretend this was procedural or coincidental. It was systemic. It was deliberate, and it was devastating. She had read about bias in textbooks, had heard speakers talk about it at assemblies, but nothing compared to the cold, measured sting of living it in real time alone. Young and dismissed, a pair of older women sitting nearby began whispering, one of them glancing sideways at Leah with an expression that hovered between pity and discomfort. Leah could feel the weight of their glances, hear the murmurs, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere that said, "She doesn't belong here." But it wasn't just the people. It was the design, the layout, the architecture of exclusion. This place had never been built with girls like her in mind. It had been built to serve a certain kind of customer and quietly turn away the rest. She looked down at her lap and saw her folder slightly open, the crisp blue edge of her scholarship letter peeking through like a forgotten truth. That letter was earned. Every grade, every test, every sleepless night had led to that moment. And yet one glance at her skin, her age, her presence, and it had all been discounted, dismissed, disrespected. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her mother's words. The world won't always welcome you, Leah, but never forget who you are and what you've earned. The fire reignited in her chest, not anger, but clarity. She wasn't going to run, she wasn't going to cry, and she certainly wasn't going to forget. Leah opened her eyes slowly. Her breathing now controlled her expression, calm, but beneath that stillness was a growing storm of quiet resolve. She shifted slightly on the bench, enough to adjust the folder in her lap, and sit taller, no longer shrinking into the corner where they'd hidden her, but claiming space with silent defiance. Just then, a sharp pair of heels echoed across the floor, and she spotted Helen speaking to a man near the entrance, tall, polished, with a presence that commanded respect. Leah narrowed her eyes, squinting to get a better look, and then recognition struck like a lightning bolt. It was Richard Evans, CEO of Argon Capital, a long-standing competitor of her mother's firm. She'd seen him before in newspaper headlines and overheard his name in late-night strategy calls when her mother thought she wasn't listening. Helen greeted him with an eagerness that stood in jarring contrast to the disdain she had shown Leah. Their conversation was low, but their body language told a story. One of Secret's exchanged glances over shoulders and a manila folder clearly labeled "confidential" being handed over with calculated precision. Leah's heart pounded. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. This wasn't just about mistreatment anymore. It was sabotage, betrayal. She leaned forward slightly, watching every subtle gesture. Richard flipped through the folder with a slight smirk, nodding slowly as if confirming something long awaited. Helen, meanwhile, smiled the kind of smile she hadn't offered to a single customer all day. Leah's instincts screamed. Her presence here hadn't just been unwanted, it had been inconvenient. A threat. If she hadn't come in that day, no one would have seen what she just witnessed. No one would have known. And that's when it hit her. She hadn't just walked into a biased transaction. She had walked into a breach of integrity that could shake everything her mother had built. This wasn't humiliation anymore. This was evidence, and she was the only one who had it. Leah's fingers moved almost on instinct. quietly sliding open the side pocket of her folder to retrieve the one item she always carried with her, her sleek silver tablet. It wasn't just for school, it was her journal, her sketch pad, her memory bank. And today, it would become her recorder of truth. She tapped the screen to life and opened the encrypted notes app, her fingers trembling only for a second before focus took over. She began typing furiously, documenting everything: the exact time Richard Evans entered the bank, the exchange of the confidential folder, Helen's deferential tone, the suspicious glances toward the lounge where she sat. Every word was chosen with surgical precision, not because she was afraid, but because she understood this could matter. Not just to her, but to her mother, to her firm, and to anyone who had ever walked into a room and been told in silent gestures they didn't belong. From behind her bench, she tilted her tablet slightly, using its back camera to quietly snap a photo of the folder in Richard's hands, capturing just enough of the label to confirm her instincts. Internal data not meant to be shared. Helen's body language said the rest, hands clasped too tightly. Eyes darting too quickly, posture too stiff. Leah's training and observation, honed through years of quiet resilience and intellectual rigor, became her shield and her weapon. She recorded snippets of dialogue. She could hear phrases like strategy leak, financial positioning, and timing before Q2. Her heart thudded as each note confirmed that what she was witnessing wasn't paranoia. It was real. It was wrong, and they had no idea she had seen it. Then, for just a flicker of a moment, Helen turned and met Leah's gaze across the room. Leah didn't flinch. She held eye contact not aggressively, but steadily, like someone who had seen far more than she was meant to and wasn't afraid of what it meant. Helen's lips tightened, the smile gone, now replaced by the faintest shadow of concern. She knew, or at least she sensed it, the girl they had tried to hide had been watching, and that Leah realized was the first shift of power. Not a scream, not a confrontation. Just the terrifying knowledge that the invisible girl had become a witness, and maybe something more. Leah didn't break eye contact, as Helen turned away abruptly, her posture stiffening, her voice lowering as she hurriedly wrapped up her conversation with Richard Evans, who offered one final handshake and exited the bank, with the confidence of someone who believed his secret transaction had gone unnoticed. But it hadn't, not even close. Leah's grip tightened around her tablet as she reviewed her notes, her heartbeat steady now, not from calm, but from purpose. She understood the magnitude of what she had seen, and she knew that silence was no longer an option. This wasn't just about a scholarship check, or the humiliation she'd endured. It was about integrity, about her mother's reputation, about exposing a betrayal that had unfolded under the guise of routine professionalism. As Helen returned to her post behind the teller counter, Leah noticed the way the woman glanced toward her seat more frequently, now her once certain movements slightly more cautious. Her smile forced Leah could feel it. Helen knew something had shifted, that the girl she had dismissed and isolated wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. She was watching, remembering, preparing. Leah tapped one final note. Helen Grant knowingly transferred confidential documents to a direct competitor. Recorded time, posture, keywords. She closed the app, locked the tablet, and folded her hands calmly over it, her gaze forward, her expression unreadable. She was no longer afraid. She was waiting because in her mind this wasn't the end of her visit to the bank. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Minutes stretched like hours as Leah sat motionless, her back straight and eyes forward, every muscle in her body taut with silent strength. Around her, the bank resumed its curated rhythm, clicks of heels, soft murmurs, polished greetings. But to Leah, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had entered hoping to prove herself. She was now the keeper of a truth that could shake the very foundation of this institution. Helen paced behind the counter, her composure brittle, stealing glances at Leah every few minutes, as if trying to decipher just how much had been seen, how much had been recorded. Leah noticed the hesitation in her gestures, the slight delay in her responses to clients, the stiffness that now cloaked her movements. It was clear Helen was unraveling, and Leah. She was only growing more certain. Every second that passed reinforced her decision not to lash out, not to raise her voice, but to stay still and let the weight of her quiet resistance speak volumes. Her mind recalled every lesson her mother had ever taught her, not just about business, but about character. Real power doesn't shout, Simone once told her. It just walks in and the room changes. And Leah, in her silence, had done just that. but she also knew that she didn't need to act alone forever. There was one person who, the moment she walked through the door, would change everything. Not with noise, but with presence. And almost as if summoned by Leah's thoughts, the sound of the bank's front doors opening cut through the tension like a blade. Leah turned, and there she was, Dr. Simone Carter, commanding in a charcoal suit, her stride elegant and deliberate eyes scanning the room until they locked with her daughter's. In that instant, Leah felt the entire balance of power shift. Dr. Simone Carter's presence cut through the air like a sudden gust of wind in a still room, unspoken, yet undeniable, magnetic, yet composed. The room which just moments ago hummed with its usual transactional noise fell into a hush as heads turned, eyes following the impeccably dressed woman who exuded both grace and gravity. Helen, who had been pacing behind the counter, froze mid-step when she saw Simone, her lips parting slightly as if to recover her mask of authority. But her instincts betrayed her shoulders tensed, her voice failed to rise. "Ms. Carter, I wasn't expecting you." She managed her tone coated with the kind of politeness that strains to hide panic. But Simone didn't offer so much as a glance to Helen. Her gaze was locked on Leah, her daughter still sitting alone in that cold corner of the bank, like an uninvited guest. Simone's eyes scanned every detail, the untouched documents, the stiff body posture, the quiet resolve in Leah's face. She didn't need to ask what happened. A mother knows. And in that moment, something fierce stirred behind Simone's calm expression. Not outrage, but something sharper. Controlled power. She walked directly to Leah, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level, her voice low, warm, and firm. "Are you all right?" Leah's lips barely moved, but the strength in her voice was unshakable. "I'm okay, but you need to hear this." She reached for her tablet and pulled up her notes without hesitation, her fingers scrolling through detailed entries, times, actions, expressions, overheard phrases, even the photo of the confidential folder. Simone's eyes darkened as she read, her jaw tightening with each line. Not because she was surprised by the betrayal, but because now she had proof witnessed, recorded, and recounted by her own daughter. As she stood to her full-height tablet still in hand, Simone finally turned to Helen. "We need to talk," she said, her voice smooth and even, but edged like a drawn blade, and suddenly the entire bank knew the reckoning had arrived. The silence in the lobby was absolute as Dr. Simone Carter stepped forward, her heels clicking with quiet authority. Her presence now a force that no one could ignore. Helen tried to gather herself, straightening her blazer and forcing a professional smile that no longer carried the same weight. "Ms. Carter, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," she began, but Simone raised a hand, not abruptly, just enough to command stillness. "No," she said calmly. "What happened here today is not a misunderstanding. It's a reflection." She turned toward the staff, toward the lingering customers, and finally back to Helen. "My daughter came here with a legitimate check earned through her hard work and discipline. She brought all her documents. She followed every rule, and yet she was ignored, interrogated, segregated, and humiliated." Her tone didn't waver, but the air in the room grew heavier with every word. And while that alone is reprehensible, it's not the worst of what happened today. Simone held up Leah's tablet. "According to this documented record, you, Ms. Grant, met with Richard Evans, CEO of a rival financial institution, and handed him a confidential folder marked as internal use only. That's not just unethical, that's a direct violation of corporate confidentiality and fiduciary responsibility." Helen's face lost all color. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Mark, the young teller, stepped back instinctively, his eyes wide with disbelief. Customers were now frozen in place, some whispering, some simply stunned. "I don't know what you think you saw." Helen finally stammered, but Simone's voice cut through her like glass. "I know exactly what my daughter saw, and more importantly, I know exactly what you've done." She took a slow step forward, never raising her voice. "You didn't just disrespect a young girl, you jeopardized the trust of every client who walks through these doors. And you attempted to compromise the very institution you were entrusted to lead." Her next words landed like a gavel. "You're finished here, Ms. Grant. Effective immediately." Helen's mouth opened as if to protest, but the words withered before they reached her tongue, replaced by a stunned silence that echoed louder than any defense she could have mustered. The polished control she wore like armor cracked visibly now, her shoulders slumped, her eyes darting between Simone and the growing crowd of witnesses who had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the background murmur of the bank's daily rhythm had died, replaced by an atmosphere so thick with tension, it was suffocating. Simone turned, slightly locking eyes with the same security guard who had earlier escorted Leah away like a threat. But this time her tone was resolute and commanding. Not cold, "Please escort Ms. Grant off the premises. Her credentials are to be revoked immediately. HR will be contacted to initiate a formal investigation." The guard hesitated only a second, then nodded, recognizing that the hierarchy had changed. As he moved toward Helen, she took an instinctive step back, her pride already shattered. "You can't," she began, voice hoarse, but Simone raised an eyebrow, her voice calm yet absolute. "I just did." The guard gestured, and Helen, now visibly trembling, gathered her bag with shaking hands. No one clapped, no one jeered. The silence was heavier than shame itself. As Helen was quietly escorted past the counter where she once stood, so confidently every employee watched her leave, not with sympathy, but with stunned clarity. When the doors closed behind her, Simone turned back to the room, her voice rising not in anger, but in leadership. "This institution will undergo an immediate review. Every process, every policy, every face behind every counter. What happened to my daughter today? What happens far too often to those who don't fit a certain mold will not happen again. Not here." Her words weren't a threat. They were a promise. And in that moment, Riverstone Trust Bank was no longer the same. In the weeks that followed, Riverstone Trust Bank underwent a transformation that rippled from the executive offices down to the frontline tellers. An independent ethics review was launched, led by Simone's own compliance firm, and within days, several internal documents surfaced, validating Leah's observations, not just the unlawful data leak to Richard Evans, but a pattern of biased service practices under Helen Grant's leadership. Several staff members were quietly let go, while others were required to complete intensive training in ethical conduct, implicit bias recognition, and equitable customer service. The tone of the bank shifted visibly. Posters emphasizing dignity and inclusion were displayed, new customer feedback mechanisms were installed, and cameras were reviewed regularly to ensure transparency. But one of the most notable changes happened quietly. The small waiting area at the back, the same place where Leah had been isolated, was remodeled into a dedicated youth banking center, designed to welcome and guide first-time teen account holders with respect and encouragement, not suspicion. Meanwhile, Mark, the young teller, who had reluctantly followed Helen's direction but later submitted a written apology, was reassigned to a mentorship program under Simone's firm, where he began to rebuild his professionalism through community outreach. And for Leah, her role in it all didn't fade into the background. Instead, she was invited to speak at the St. Barry Academy Assembly, where she stood before hundreds of students and told her story, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. She spoke of quiet courage, of speaking through observation, and of never letting anyone's doubt define your worth. When she finished, the applause wasn't loud, it was lasting. She had turned a moment of isolation into a wave of awakening, not just for a bank, but for a generation. Watching what it means to stand tall when others try to make you feel small, Leah's story quickly spread beyond the walls of her school and the polished halls of Riverstone Trust. Local news outlets picked up the account after a reporter attending the St. Barry Academy Assembly was moved by her poised, powerful delivery. Headlines soon followed: "Teen exposes corporate breach," and "Bias, 14-year-old holds." "Bank accountable students calm, courage sparks." "Industry-wide reform." What began as a humiliating morning inside a cold lobby transformed into a movement of awareness, pushing other financial institutions to re-examine their front-end policies, particularly around youth and minority clients. Simone, while proud, remained characteristically humble, redirecting praise toward her daughter. "I've spent my career managing billions in assets," she said in one interview, but what Leah did that day, speaking truth without fear. That was the most valuable investment of all invitations poured in for Leah to speak on youth empowerment panels, financial literacy workshops, and educational podcasts. Yet she remained grounded, choosing to spend most of her time creating a free digital resource guide for teens navigating financial systems, complete with simple deposit tutorials, rights awareness videos, and a section titled, "What to Do When You're Not Taken Seriously." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't viral, but it was real, and it was hers. One afternoon, while sitting beside her mother at their kitchen table, Leah looked up and said quietly, "I didn't think anyone would believe me." Simone reached across, squeezed her hand gently, and replied, "That's how change begins, when the people who aren't expected to speak become impossible to ignore." In that moment, Leah realized that what she had experienced was never just a personal injustice. It was a mirror, a lesson, and most of all, an opening. And she had chosen not to walk away, but to step through it. Months later, on a calm spring afternoon, Leah found herself walking once again through the glass doors of Riverstone Trust Bank. But this time, everything was different. The front desk staff greeted her by name, not out of fear, but with genuine respect. The air no longer carried the chill of judgment, but a quiet warmth of awareness and growth. On the wall near the entrance, a new framed plaque read, "In honor of Leah Carter, for reminding us that integrity has no age and courage needs no title." Beneath it, a small quote she had chosen herself. "You don't have to raise your voice to raise the truth." Leah stood before it for a moment, silent, the memory of that difficult day flashing through her mind, not with pain, but with pride. She hadn't just exposed injustice, she had helped rebuild a system that now welcomed others like her. Behind her, a mother guided her young son to the teller window, and Leah smiled as the staff patiently explained his new savings account to him, speaking with kindness and care. It was small, but it mattered, just like her first visit, just like her voice. As she turned to leave, she spotted a familiar figure near the exit, Mark, the former teller, now wearing a name badge that read, "Community Outreach Officer." Their eyes met, and he gave her a nod of silent acknowledgement. She returned it with a soft smile, not out of forgiveness, but because she understood something. Now real change isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. Outside, her mother waited beside the car, watching her daughter with the kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken. Leah climbed in, and as they pulled away, she glanced back one last time at the building that had once tried to make her feel small. But she wasn't small anymore, she never had been. And now the world knew it too. Leah didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard. In a world that too often dismisses the young, the quiet, or the different, she proved that dignity, truth, and courage speak loudest when they come from within. Her story is a reminder that power isn't always in position, it's in action. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Comment and share to spread Leah's message. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to Flow Story, where real voices spark real change.